consumers. I know families who adopt
Okay, good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico. Starting oil painting Chinese food. Buck a scoop, prelude to the apocalypse. Here we go.
So, I think the principal objection to the scheme is, the third point, this is the very policy the government of China is trying to enforce for 2 or 3 decades now, each family to have only one child. So the scheme has actually been tried, and one has to say in the case of China, it's had some success. The birth rate is slower there than in India, but it hasn't been completely successful because of the difficulty of enforcing it. Now, I take your point that it's easier to sell to women in Berkeley than it is to women in Shanghai. But I think the biggest problem to overcome is the prejudice against only children. Since all of us have had 2 children each, if we ask ourselves why we had 2 children rather than 1, we certainly didn't have them because we thought we'd get more prosperous by having 2 children. It must have been obvious before we did it that we'd be poorer. It must have been obvious that there'd be a smaller amount of available resources to be spent on them. There was a very strongly established feeling that somehow there's something wrong with being an only child. And that seems to be the most powerful psychological obstacle that has to be overcome for this plan to be put into operation. Maybe we'll leave it there. Now I'll come later to my own patent scheme for dealing with the demographic situation.
Yes. Well, as I understand it, Terence, you challenged the botanical logos to provide a solution, and it came up with this plan. And then you derived these demographic consequences which are startling to you and interesting. And if we were to achieve the gain that this plan proposes, we would then need a 3rd step, which I guess hasn't been done yet, and that is to solve the problem how this plan is to be implemented. So, although I agree with Rupert that not wanting to insult the entity, the fact is the plan is not very original, still I'm going to suggest that you go back to the entity to ask how this would be implemented, because in your demographics there is this very big if everyone is home. Now, for every family to have 1 child, let's say every woman to have 1 child, is not demographically different from many families on the average having 1 child. That's a different implementation of the same policy. And many countries, developed countries, now do have approximately 0 population growth, which means their average is about 2.
Right.
So this 1 is less than 2, and that's significantly less, and that's interesting. But as far as people adopting this plan, putting this plan in force, persuading people, educating, here's the big if. What is step 3? How do you implement this plan? And this is, as a matter of fact, the real problem in saving the world, and it's the one that we've been talking about in several meetings in the past. Do you use education? This is a common theory that the reason that developed countries have achieved 0 population growth is because of education. Or do you change the mythology? I mean, all of the possibilities that we've discussed for making a paradigm shift, a social transformation in general, all of them would be applicable to this problem. But which? How? What? Through education, youth, rewards? How do you provoke the phase shift in consciousness which would result in people feeling as their personal goal to get the population growth of their neighborhood down to half?
Well,
right? 50%.
You have to point out this thing that personal wealth and leisure time will increase if this policy is followed. In other words, people will follow their own best interests. So you can't appeal to some higher set of goals. You just have to say, wouldn't you like to work less and have more money?
Well, I think there might be a solution to this problem, but I doubt that's it. I think that Rupert is right. There's a preference based on actual experience for two, not for two, for 0 or 2. What we would need here is to have more zeros and still some 2s. And what is really missing, I think, is for a large number of women to accept that they don't want to have any children at all. That is the real problem. And of course, there already are many women who don't plan to have any children at all. But to increase the proportion of women who are choosing that as their first preference, the number of children they want to produce their entire lifetime is 0, I think that's the difficulty.
Yes, well, I think that celibacy is a misplaced impulse in this direction. Celibacy does, it's arguable that it does anybody any good, but if it were redefined to be thought quite a nice thing for people to make the sacrifice of having no children, and such people were honored in society in the way that we now honor celibate priests, or we recognize them as a special class. If people knew that by having no children they would receive a certain measure of deference in society, then large numbers of people might opt for that.
Yes, well, that's reasonable. I absolutely reject the connection between sexual activity and reproduction. I know, I've heard that there is some kind of connection. But I think that the women, politically correct women in Berkeley and Santa Monica and so on that we're talking about, they are mostly having children because they want to. They've elected to. I mean, there are lesbian women who have children because they want to. There are celibate people who have children because they wanted to have a child. They change their pattern only because they wanted to have a child. The wanting to have a child is the cause of reproduction, not mysterious and unsuspected byproduct of being sexually active. So I think we need, in order to resolve this final problem here, in the entity's suggestion, we need to find some educational or mythogenetic strategy whereby people would really yearn to have 0 children, with or without sexual activity, and have all kinds of...
Well, I think this could be done in all kinds of ways, through education, through tax incentives, through direct payment. Also, I don't accept your...
Direct payment?
I don't accept the premise that faced with one's desire to have 2 children, or if that were linked to wrecking the planet, I think people would just have 1 child anyway.
Yes, well, that's a possible breakthrough.
And in fact, we don't know the consequences of having 1 child if it were generally accepted. I think a lot of the 1 child talk that goes around has to do with the fact of the myth of the special character of the single child. And daycares, all kinds of social institutions could be retooled to make sure that these children spend a lot of time with other children. So I don't see that as a tremendous barrier. I agree with you. I think we should encourage people, 1, to have no children. Those people should be given special honors.
Otherwise to have 1.
Otherwise to have 1.
And never to have 2.
And never to have 2.
People should accept that nuclear families don't really exist in this society, and so they're going to be single parents, and that makes it more attractive to have just 1.
That's right.
Having 2 single parents, each with 1, combined in a house, then in fact they'd have a sort of nuclear family with 2 children, except both the parents would be female.
And the other thing is to start in these high-tech societies. Don't start in India and Sri Lanka. That makes no sense whatsoever. Start in the areas where you're likely to make many converts. Then these third world societies, which are tending to take their value systems from by emulation of the high-tech societies, would see the positive feedback of these policies and would quite naturally adapt them themselves in due time.
Well, I think we do have a plan here, this sort of rounded out
Well,
let's hear Rupert's other plan.
No, let me just raise one further objection which has to be overcome. I mean, first, giving single children and single-child families better names seems to be the most important, and you think the easiest aspect of this plan. Well, that seems very important. Studies on, I never saw the case against two children until we'd already got to. When I read an article in a newspaper in Britain, The Guardian, which was a fervent denunciation of the two-child norm. I'd never ever seen this before. I'd seen plenty of things about what's wrong with only children. But this said that having two children is grossly abnormal. In the past, people had large families. We've had multiple children, multiple relationships. With two, you set up automatically a dyadic relationship with jealousy, possessiveness, and fighting, which creates a one-on-one competition situation which is atypical of the whole of human race in the past, and that two children, in fact, may be a great deal worse than one. Now, that was a strong argument. It's the only time I've ever seen an argument put in favour of a single child as opposed to two. And it was a well-put case, and it had quite an impact on me. It might even have influenced my own thinking on the subject had I read it before we'd had to. So this re-evaluation of the role of two versus one children is something that a great deal more attention could be paid to. Studies could be made on the subject. It may well turn out that this argument can be validated in all sorts of terms, and that the two-child norm can be discredited as a kind of myth or ideal in favour of the one-child norm. Now, that would be a highly constructive act, together with social policies that would deal better with the problem of only children and all the rest of it. Somehow, ways of living or where children spend more time with other children. Anyone with a single child spends most of their time ferrying the child around to other houses so they can play with other children. This could be made easier. But there's a serious political objection to the whole thing, which is that in a democratic society of one person, one vote, the single most important thing that influences people's thinking about this question is being outvoted by the others. In Ireland, in Northern Ireland, the great fear is that Catholics have more children than the Protestants, and they'll take over. In the Soviet Union, the fear many Russians have is that the Muslim republics have enormous birth rates compared with European Russia, and that in a democratic Soviet Union, they'll take over. The fear in the United States surely must be that for the woman in Malibu or Santa Monica, that within 5 years, maybe 10 years, Hispanics will take over control of Los Angeles, within 25 years or 10 years, 15 years of California, and within 50 years of the entire United States. And then they'll change the rules because they believe in larger families and they won't want to go along with this kind of norm. That's the kind of objection which I think will strike people very deeply and raise tremendous fears.
I think there's an answer to that particular objection, which is by take over, what you mean is claim an unfair amount of the wealth of the society or the resources of the political power. But notice that in a society where this kind of policy was slowly taking hold, all segments of society would grow more wealthy, and there would be a diminishing anxiety about resource availability because there would be an ever-expanding available pool of resources. In other words, if we're going to cut the Earth's population in half, then there's going to be twice as much land and wealth to go around. And so people would see themselves progressively enriched, generally and specifically. I mean, in a world where the population is dropping by 50% every 50 years, every time you got your mail, you would learn that a distant cousin's line had died out and that his estates and bank accounts had been ceded to you.
So you think a chain letter principle is the one
That's the big issue then, because, Terence, you already accepted the fact that in Bangladesh the population growth is not going to decrease, only in Santa Monica and Berkeley.
No, first in those places. I'm saying don't preach it in Bangladesh first. Demonstrate it in the high-tech societies, and everyone else will follow along. And as a society becomes more wealthy, that means more educated, the case will make more and more sense. It's something that it's interesting that the burden of working this all out would fall on the women in the high-tech societies who have claimed that they have never taken their due role in human destiny, and here would be a chance for them to step forward and lead us all into a better world by their demonstration.
Well, I think in the case of our own experience in our own families and co-parenting arrangements, we had participated with our wives in a discussion about how many children to have and so on. And that probably would be the case in these high-tech developed countries and families and so on. Though it would be sort of a partnership of men and women that would have to come to this new understanding.
But women would take clearly a flagship role in all this.
Yes, well, suppose that Rupert's idea that a reason for large families and anxiety about the voting situation in democratic countries, and well, we could change the vote so that siblings of the same mother would share one vote. That would take care of that.
I think there are cleaner ways to take care of that. I mean, I see this objection, but I think it could be met that the social planners, you could put in place incentives. I think it could be met. People are anxious. They don't want to lose power or wealth or land. And the very notion of falling demographic reverses this pressure. And everyone, even those for whom the policy is working least well, are still living in a better situation than if the policy were not in place. If the policy is not adopted or something like it, we all lose. If the policy is adopted, most of us would gain.
Well, if we accepted, just for the sake of discussion, that the present population of the planet is an okay number, then we don't have to seek a decrease, then zero population growth on a planetary scale would be our goal. Let's just more identical. No, it isn't true, but for the sake of discussion, let's consider that. Then we already have achieved our goal in developed nations, many of them, and not in the rest of the world. So according to your idea, if this would apply to the one-child plan, that the success of this plan would then diffuse over the underdeveloped countries, that we should see that already happening, and yet we don't.
No, I think we do. As standards of living rise, population rates slow. This has been observed all over the world.
I know that the standard of living is not rising because the population is growing and outstripping the resources, and people have this enormous famine in Africa, and their response to this famine is to have more and more children.
But for instance, in Thailand, South Korea, the emerging the industrial countries of Southeast Asia, the population is slowing, and it's generally credited to the rising standard of living and expansion of the industrial base.
Yes. I mean, there's one further point, perhaps not such a serious one, which is the thing that terrifies people as well is not just being outvoted by the increase of one section of the population relative to the other, like Hispanics, but also the question of immigration. And in Vancouver, for example, within 5 years, there'll probably be a majority of Chinese. Hong Kong Chinese are flooding in every day, great plane loads of them, just buying up a lot of property in Vancouver. Mexicans are flooding into the southern parts of the United States. This idea of people flooding in, the Germans are now getting worried that East Germans, they thought by unifying the country they could decrease immigration from East Germany. In fact, it's increased. And now everyone in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, with any ambition and who's prepared to move, looks to Western Europe as the place to go. Any moment, people in West Germany are really afraid. If there really is a kind of European economic free zone that includes all of Europe, a free movement of peoples, just what they've been claiming they want. For 30, 40 years they've been claiming this is what they want. If that's what they get, 100 million Russians will probably want to move to West Germany. The problem with immigration is a very serious problem for a lot of people, and this is another reason, as well as being outvoted by demographic increase within the same country, the problem of immigration from others. The yellow peril, these kinds of things have been...
But these immigrations are fueled by population, uncontrolled growth of population.
Well, they're not, because Eastern Europe has had one of the lowest population growth rates in the world in the last 30 or 40 years. So tough that the congestion gene, the population of Romania and other countries in Eastern Europe has actually been falling, much to the consternation of their governments. They've had the lowest population growth rates anywhere. They've had negative growth rates. The people aren't moving to the same, they're moving to the
But you see, that's just a problem. We will always have problems. What we're trying to do here is figure out how to save the world.
No, we have a chicken and egg problem, because the logical consequence of your theory is that we have to solve all the other problems of the world in order to solve the population problem. So the proposition at the beginning of your introduction, that which I concur, that the population problem is the basic problem, somehow that's not really so logistically. That all nations have to be developed nations. People have to have education. They have to accept this new idea. They have to be impressed by the success of this plan as it's applied in other nations. Like all of that implies the solution of all these problems. So the demographic shifts of a constant population in new locations would end because the inequalities of resources and that this would have been solved.
Well, people will always migrate to where there are more jobs or better lives, but if they are truly not migrating because of overpopulation in their homeland, then they are emptying out their homeland. And that means in the future there will be empty land to be reintegrated into the global economy. The price Germany pays now by having millions of Poles move into Germany means that in the next century, Poland will be a wonderful frontier for economic growth and a theater where people can
all right, I like that.
very stable, happy lives.
That's pretty fun. I like the softness of the color. Kind of reminds me of an Arshile Gorky at the moment. Meets Picasso and Matisse. But anyway, I think I'm going to take a bit of Payne's Gray and just do a little more to the line work with a bit thicker, more viscous paint to give the lines a little more clarity. So I'm going to do a second session coming up soon. Cutting here.
What is really needed is rapid reduction of the human
Take
population.
two.
25% of this current strength.
Well, but see, the longer you wait, the more resources you're using up. I mean, are there a couple of centuries worth of petroleum around? Are there a couple of centuries worth of hydroelectric power?
Well, I think if zero population growth on a planetary scale were achieved in the very near future, if we could achieve that, we could achieve anything.
Well, you would only achieve planetary ZPG if in large areas of the world you had less than ZPG. Because you would be taking up the slack in those laggard areas.
No. But whatever it is, it's easier to achieve than what you're proposing. Because if people in Southern California, let us say, are seeing that their section of the population is going to decrease to half within 50 years, in the same span of time that these other folks are going to be multiplied by 4, is obviously not going to go. No one is going to accept that.
Why not? The people in Southern California will be twice as rich. The people in the other area will be 4 times more impoverished.
I'm talking about, let us say, another sector of the population in Southern California, which is multiplying at a rapid rate with, let's say, 12% population growth per year, so doubling the population in 5 years.
Through immigration and increase.
Yeah, well, that's the birth rate in Mexico right now, so it's increasing 12% per year.
Can't be 12%.
No?
No, it's more than about 3.5%.
Excuse me.
Maybe
This is in the transcript.
Well, I'm not saying it. You're not going to save the planet with a snap of the finger. But since the other things on the table to solve this problem are thermonuclear wars, synthetic viruses, pogroms, genocide, triage, and computer-directed mass starvation, this sounds to me like a pretty good idea.
You haven't read my plan yet.
Have at it.
This plan was conceived when I first went to India and was published in Nature in 1974. And the reason I had a slightly weary attitude to plans for solving the world's population is that having had one myself and promoting it vigorously in international circles, including various sort of international aid agencies and kind of working as part of one, I had the ear of people of influence and so on. I was in a good position to do it. The fact that nothing's come of it over the following 17 years has slightly discouraged me. Anyway, the scheme, as it goes, is quite simple. It's based on the perception that in third world countries and in advanced ones, but largely in countries like India, where population growth is greatest, people have lots of children not because they want to have lots of children, acquire children, but because they want to have lots of sons.
Yes.
That point is, I think, quite clear. If you can talk to any Indian, any Chinese, what they want is sons. They don't want daughters.
Yes, the Chinese throw the daughters in the river.
Yes, and so the Indians practice female infanticide in the Rajput and other castes. What they go and pray, they spend good money on doing ceremonies in temples, pujas, to try and have more sons than daughters. Incidentally, this provides a test of the power of prayer of a statistical kind. I checked out the male-to-female excess in the birth rate in India as opposed to other countries. It's 106 to 100 males to females in live births in India. So it is in Western countries where there's no such strong prejudice. So one could, in favour of sons. So clearly, on a large scale, the magical and religious means used to try and promote the appearance of sons are not effective, statistically speaking. They may shift the balance in individual cases. But anyway, the fact is they want sons. Now, rather than trying to go against the tide, trying to persuade people to have less sons or less children, no, you give them what they want. Now, it was discovered in the early 70s that male sperm swim more strongly than female sperm. And in vitro, in test tubes, if you put them in a viscous solution, any viscous substance will do, and they have to swim through it, there's a progressive enrichment of male sperm getting through the other side. There are other ways of separating them that have been investigated by the artificial insemination industry, because with cows, you basically want to have females rather than males. So there's some research gone into this. Anyway, with human sperm, like many other species, male sperm swims stronger than female. My proposal was a simple technical advance whereby a capsule of a viscous substance like carboxymethyl cellulose, very cheap, buffered at an appropriate pH, would be inserted before intercourse into the vagina. The sperm would have to swim through it in order to fertilize the egg, and this would give a preferential enrichment of male sperm. Now, the thing may be only partially effective. It may only increase the chances to 60-40 instead of 53-50, which is the present ratio. However, even a slight increase, as long as it was perceived as being increasing the chances would lead to rapid adoption of this thing. Even if it was banned by governments, the black market would spring up immediately. The product would be extremely cheap to make, assuming that this technical problem could be overcome. You could make the product technically. The result of this, let us assume that it could work with an efficiency, say, promoting the chance of 75 to 25 in favour of sons. It's a reasonable assumption. It would be widely adopted. The proportion of boys would increase. The number of children required to achieve the right level, the desired number of sons would go down, so there would be a more adoption of birth control immediately. But of course the main consequences would come within one generation time, which is about 15 years in India, since the average age of marriage for girls is about 14 in most parts of India. Then, of course, the consequence would be that there would be a shortage of girls. Not all these young men could get married to girls. Or even if you had a system of polyandry developing, the rate-limiting fact for population growth is the number of women. So, when we couldn't increase childbearing beyond one child a year maximum, however many men they were married to or had sex with or whatever. So there'd now be an immediate bottleneck on population growth. Population growth would begin to plummet. There'd of course be social consequences associated with this, and most Westerners who had this plan said, well, of course they'd all get militaristic, you'd have appalling wars. That's not the reaction I heard from anyone in India. The Indians don't have such a militaristic tradition. What would probably happen there is that you get a rising age at which men could get married. And instead of a dowry system, which is what causes people to not want daughters, there'd be the rapid development of a bride price system, as people would have to bid higher prices to get the available girls, which would solve another problem, namely the low social status of women and the desire not to have daughters. And within 30 years, the whole system would re-equilibrate, because the desire to have sons rather than daughters would cease to have the same motivation. The entire social pattern would adjust. There'd be social problems in between, but nothing like the social problems caused by the doubling of the population in the next 25 years. This plan which would go with the grain.
And the plot is to have them or have clouds drifting through them and sort of merging them into the background and dissolving them into clouds. But we'll see how it goes. I like the start anyway, but before I start with any cloud work, I'm going to let that set up. So that's it for the moment. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico. Working on oil painting Chinese food, bucket scoop, prelude to the apocalypse.
That's true. I read in last week, and I've forgotten where, that the
Have a good night.